Wow, it's so bright up here. Oh my gosh, and you're so dark. Thank you for having me. Let's give it up for all the staff. This is awesome. It takes a lot of courage to put on an event, so this is really wonderful. So thanks to BackerKit. I'd like to thank Max and Ro and Casey and Jason and Andy for inviting me to be here today. I'm super stoked, and it's always very much a privilege to have an audience. It's also great to be back in San Francisco because I actually lived here for almost 10 years. I lived in the Richmond district, and this trip has very much felt kind of like a homecoming. Actually I got here a little bit early. I got to see some friends, which you can't see because I have a horrible phone. Got to sing a few songs at the Mint with my friend Sadie. But the best part was I got to stop by my favorite restaurant in the Richmond district called Halu, which is excellent. Give it up for Halu. And I made it into their Instagram. So that's me over there, and I've always wanted to be on their Instagram, and I can't do it because I don't live in San Francisco anymore. So it's been a great few days. San Francisco is also kind of where everything started for me. When I moved here, I was a laid-off, unemployed knowledge worker in 2001, and I kind of had the good fortune of actually stumbling into this really amazing community of creators. A bunch of my friends were musicians. I think many of them are here today. This is a band called the Invisible Cities, featuring Han Wang, Sadie Cantini, Tim Bulkley, and Go Nakamura, who's also a singer-songwriter. And we used to do a lot of fun things. This is my apartment in the Richmond district, and along with our friend Kendall, who's over on sound at the bottom, we would live stream house concerts from my living room, and then people would bring food over, and it was just this really amazing, wonderful experience. And then through that process also, I got to kind of get involved with the local film community. And somehow I kind of stumbled into becoming an executive producer and investor of two small kind of micro-budget indie films called Surrogate Valentine and Daylight Savings. And both of these films premiered at South by Southwest. And the real joy of this experience was just learning to understand the process of making a film and getting kind of a first-hand view into a certain type of creator, right? I think what musicians face, what filmmakers face, they're very related, but there are also some very specific nuances. In 2010, I moved to New York, and kind of moving to New York continued this process of being exposed to a different set of creators. So my first job there was at a venture capital firm called Uniscore Ventures. They were early investors in companies like Twitter, Kickstarter, Etsy, Tumblr, and this job gave me a front row seat to creators as venture capital financed entrepreneurs and CEOs and founders, as well as the rank and file. That then led to a teaching gig at the School of Visual Arts in their MFA in Interaction Design program, which is a 2-year program, and that experience of teaching in 2012 onward is really kind of the genesis for starting Orbital. So I want to spend a little bit of time kind of walking through these last two because I think there's some really great stories to tell. So as Mike mentioned, in 2014 I started my own space called Orbital, and it's an old tenement building in the Lower East Side. It's 6,000 square feet. It's 100 years old. It is kind of barely habitable in a way, but I think there's a lot of beauty in that kind of imperfection. And so I launched it, not as a co-working space, but kind of a studio for my own projects, and specifically a studio for building networks. And when I say networks, I'm not talking about Cisco routers. I'm talking about networks of people, communities. So by day, Orbital is a collaborative workspace home to a multidisciplinary community of creators. We've got about 40+ members. Some of those people are entrepreneurs. Some of them are artists or activists, freelancers. This is my friend Kenyatta Cheese. He has a company called Everybody at Once, which does audience development for brands and TV shows and film. This is my friend Nikki Cillian Tang, who's probably most famous for her parking sign redesign project. And this is my friend Evan Leong, who's a Bay Area native. He is the director of the Jeremy Lin documentary, Linsanity, and he's currently working on his first feature. And there's a whole bunch of really awesome people who work out of the space from all sorts of backgrounds, and that's kind of the joy of the space. In a way, kind of starting the space was kind of my weird, socially awkward trick to get all of my friends to hang out in the same place with me during business hours. So it's been a lot of fun. We also run programs at Orbital. So there's a program called the Communities of Practice. And the goal of the Communities of Practice is to help foster peer networks amongst people who work in kind of the same function with the same level of responsibility, and specifically in tech. So with a couple of friends of mine, Camille Fournier and Kellen Elliott McRae, who were both experienced CTOs, and my friend Leland Reckes, who is not pictured, we kind of decided to start this program to bring these professionals together, because when you are working as a designer or a product manager or an engineering manager in a tech company, you're often going to run into problems that you honestly can't ask your coworkers about. The workspace is kind of a performative environment. You're there to show everyone that you know what you're doing. So given that, it's not really a very safe space to share your deepest worries or to talk about the hard problems that you have. But what if you had access to a peer network of people who were across the entire industry but don't actually work with you, right? And if you could successfully bring them into a space, and if you could teach them to learn to trust each other, to ask those questions, could we actually not run a training program, but create networks that last beyond the scope of the program, so that down the road, a year later, 2 later, when you're in a tough spot, when you have a hard problem, when you're looking to change jobs, you have people that you can turn to who are not your coworkers, to resolve those things. And so that's kind of been the goal of the Communities of Practice. We have another program called Orbital Bootcamp. And rather than run an accelerator or an incubator for startups specifically, we had this idea of trying to foster creation, and we framed it as a bootcamp for side projects. Whether you were working on a creative project, a social project, or a business, we wanted to create a home for a multidisciplinary set of creators to come in and learn to launch together. And so we've had artists who have come in who have used Kickstarter as a way to experiment with actual new offerings. Like Mohammed had this idea of kind of creating a mail art club, and so he came in and launched a Kickstarter project through the program. Dior Vargas has been an advocate for people of color and mental illness, and so she wanted to do a project around humanizing that and gathering photos, and so we helped her launch her project. Tara Reid and we also help people launch businesses, and Tara Reid is kind of a really great story here, because she actually launched 2 businesses through her work at Orbital. She launched a art advisor startup called Collecto, as well as her own bootcamp, program, which was modeled off of her unique process of using off-the-shelf products. Because she's a solo, non-technical founder, she kind of would use all of these things off the shelf and actually build interactive products using that. And it resulted in a bootcamp called Apps Without Code. And she's gone on to serve over 100 people, a large percentage of whom are women of color, and it's been really great. And not only has she been helping them launch products, but she's actually been helping them run and launch their own businesses. And so it's kind of really cool and meta that our bootcamp program has resulted in someone else launching their own bootcamp program. I'm really stoked about that. So the longest thread, I think, of my time in New York has really been teaching at this program. The School of Visual Arts is a program with a lot of small little programs attached to it. And the specific program that I teach in is the MFA in Interaction Design, which is a 2-year graduate program led by Liz Danzico, who is also the creative director at NPR. And as Mike mentioned, I co-teach a class called Entrepreneurial Design with my partner, Christina Shi. And it's a little bit of a weird class, because we don't really think of it as a class. We think of it more as kind of a reality TV game show. And where the students have to go out and complete challenges in the real world. And it's really kind of scary, right? Because the real world is scary, right? You have to confront uncertainty. You have to go out and try things and see if they work, and they may not work. And so the students have to complete a series of small challenges. And like any game show, there's a really big challenge at the end. And so that big challenge is that they have to launch a project that will make $1,000 by the end of the semester using the internet. And it's really hard because it forces you as a student to work in public. It forces you to come up with an idea of your own and to think about how you apply your skills and talents, not for the production of someone else's idea, but for your own idea. And that's a really, really daunting process. And you have to confront the uncertainty and the chaos of the world as a result. But the students step up to the challenge, and they make really beautiful things. So for example, one of my favorite projects is called the Cheese Map. And this was launched by a woman named Guri Venstad, who really loved cheese and really loved maps. So her whole project was basically making maps out of blown up photos of cheese, like stenciled into like countries, which is totally crazy, right? I mean, like, this is amazing. Who would have thought? And so she launched this project, and she raised almost $3,000. She got all these offers from cheese shops who wanted to buy them wholesale, and she never realized that she'd be connected to cheese lovers and map lovers all over the world. Another project is by a student named Shelly Nee, who wanted to make a little bit more of a statement around kind of women's fashion. And so she decided to create a feminist superhero underwear line called the League of Ladies, which star cartoon versions of Frida Kahlo, Marie Curie, and Amelia Earhart. And that went on to raise about $7,000, which did really well. Another team of students, Luke Stern and Sam Wander, decided they wanted to create a card game. And so they created a card game called Game of Phones, which is like Cards Against Humanity, except you have to use your phone to answer some of the questions. And that's done very well for them, and they raised about $16,000. Overall, people always ask this question of how many people were successful, and so these are the actual numbers. 54% of the 99 students who've taken the course, they've raised about $300,000. I will say last year we got this percentage up to 76%. But this class is really, 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 really not about making the money, right? The money's a device. It's a game show, remember? It's a device to get you to think about how you get started. And if you can get started, then you can have an experience. And if you have an experience, then we can teach you along the way. But if you don't get started, you can't really do anything, right? So this whole thing is really just kind of a really horrible manipulation of our class. But as a result, you learn stuff, right? The huge gulf between theory and practice. You learn by doing. You learn that the best thing that you can do is simply to get started. And by far and large, whether a student's project has been successful financially or not, they punch so far above their weight, they start to realize that they're far more capable of things than they may have realized. And that carries forward, that confidence is so priceless, it carries forward into their future work. I think one of the best lessons, and the biggest lessons they learn, is they learn how to leverage each other for help. This notion that we are worthy of other people's support is so incredible, right? And I think a lot of it is because stereotypically we think about the creative process as if it's a single-player game. But it really should be a multiplayer game, right? It should be a multiplayer experience. You need to involve anybody and anything. The other lesson that they learn is that outcomes are absolutely out of their control. And that can be very, very frustrating, especially for designers, because designers like to control everything. No judging. This is a project called What Would B Say? And it's a card game by a student, Datriana Meeks, who didn't actually hit the funding goal. And by the way, that was largely my fault, which is for another story. But her project was such a great idea, it just took off. It got a lot of press. Everybody was writing about it. Because it's kind of cool, right? Beyonce playing cards, who wouldn't want that, right? We all want that, I want that. And the genius thing about this was, because it picked up so much press, it ended up kind of landing her a meeting with Beyonce's VP of Worldwide Marketing, right? This is not an outcome that she could have engineered in her wildest imagination, right? You would never have known unless you've launched, right? And that is the goal of the class, is not necessarily to get $1,000, but to put things out in the world. How do we know otherwise? It's very much a call and response. Amy Wu is a student who did a project called Queens Made, which features the stories of creators in Queens, New York. And a couple of months later after launching it, she found that it was featured in an Apple keynote for an iPad launch, right? That's totally nuts. And if you remember the Game of Phones game that I mentioned before, which is actually now available in Target stores across the country, this project got picked up by librarians who found it and were like, this is an amazing tool to teach students to learn how to research things on the web, right? And so this crazy game they came up with, I think drunk in a bar, ended up being a really great educational tool, right? Who knew? So these outcomes are all things that you don't really know about until you put things out there. You have to try. You have to go through this experience. And through kind of the class, the cohort, the constraints, everything, they're able to do that. So if I kind of look back on the 10 years that I've spent working with creators, whether they're musicians, filmmakers, entrepreneurs, designers, I think like my motivation in retrospect, because I think, again, it's very easy to piece the story together in retrospect. I have no idea what I'm doing when I'm looking forward, has all been in the service of this question, what do creators need to be successful? And if I have learned anything, if you take anything away from this talk, because there's a lot of stuff that I'm telling you about, it's this, which is that success is a function of access to networks, right? Money, power, information, people, opportunities, influence, all these things come through networks. And this is a great, I think, distillation, but it's also problematic, right? I think for one, we lack access to networks aligned with our aspirations. We have our friends, we have our families, we have our coworkers. And if we're lucky, some subset of those might actually be the right people to help us with an idea that we have. But often, those are networks that exist for very specific purposes. They don't necessarily exist for our aspirations. And so how do we go build that? And then also, we live in a very inequitable world, right? Certain people have access to networks that other people do not, right? And that is not just. And so how do you fix that? How do you address that? How do you make creating things not solely the privilege of those who have the time and the capital to do so, right? I think we'll see better things in the world if we can equalize that. And then also, like, networks are kind of this weird invisible construct. We don't really think about them every day. So if someone does me a favor, I tend to attribute my appreciation to the individual, not to the network from which we're connected. They're not systems, I think, that we're trained to think about from the start. And further, we often see kind of the act of creating, framed as a binary: buyers, sellers, creators, backers. But there are so many other actors involved in the system that contribute to the success of the things that we do, right? And I think that we have to think about it as an ecosystem. You've got birds, you've got plants, you've got all sorts of animals. And so we need networks of peers, right? Through networks of peers, we can exchange information and advice and lessons. We need collaborators. The more collaborators, the deeper our networks, the better, we have a larger world of partnerships that we can explore. You have more possibilities if you have a larger network of potential collaborators. We need networks. We definitely need networks of support. Supporters, advocates, advisors, and then the people who provide you advice are not necessarily the people that you're going to turn to when you need a hug, right? And those could be two different networks. And certainly, they may not necessarily be the same network that you turn to for financial support. So I'm a big believer in being very intentional about cultivating all these networks. And it's largely because I see kind of these networks as infrastructure. And if you're a creator, you don't just want to focus on the work that you want to make. You want to think about the infrastructure that's going to support you, much in the way that as a city, you have transportation infrastructure, you have housing infrastructure, you have social infrastructure, you have all these systems and programs and stuff that's put in place that enables you to do things that you need to do. And the other thing, too, is when we think about being kind of a resilient creator, I think that it's very dangerous to think about resilience as like a superpower, right? As someone somehow has the fortitude to weather the storms that you do not, or they can weather the setbacks or the failures. And it's really not about, I think, having a superpower. I think it's really about the strengths of the roots, right? To what degree are you connected? To what degree are you resourced? To what degree are you supported? And I think in order to be resilient, you have to be intentional about building infrastructure. So there's a good question of, like, how do you do this? Like, how do you build networks? What are they? They're invisible. I can't see them. Right? And it's, and the problem is, like, this is not how you build networks, right? And this is, most of the networking infrastructure that we have today was built by very socially awkward people like 15 years ago, which is why our software applications work the way they do. But this is not how you build communities, right? LinkedIn's a database. It's a great database, but it's a database. And I think there's also kind of a framing around building networks that maybe is somewhat misleading too, right? We don't build networks bit by bit or piece by piece. In my experience, networks are formed, right? They're formed around signals, They coalesce. And all you can do as a creator is plant a flag and see who decides to show up. Again, you don't get to control outcomes. You're not entitled to people showing up. It's kind of like a message in a bottle. And I think the question that you have to ask is, like, what makes a good signal? So what I've learned is challenges make great signals. That's why crowdfunding is so effective. And we use Kickstarter exclusively in the class that we teach because of their all-or-nothing model, right? If you were to receive as a creator every single dollar that was pledged to you, it's not really a challenge. But to be able to participate in a challenge, to have kind of space for kind of a call to action, like challenges are exciting. That's kind of why we take this framing of a reality TV game show for our class. And then, so in our class, every single student is the protagonist. They're all centered in their own narratives, and that's what makes challenges great. I think the other thing too is invitations also make great signals. How do you invite people to the dinner party? How do you create space? How do people know that they're welcome? What are the things that you can do in terms of having a welcome sign at the door versus a "you are not welcome" sign at the door? That was a really horrible example. So this is all abstract, so I want to maybe kind of like drill this down into a specific example. So this is a project by one of my students, Amy Yoshida, who had this great project around getting more girls of color involved in like local politics and local communities. And so she had this idea of creating workshops, and she did a Kickstarter project in order to create the workbooks that do that. And this is a great challenge, right? Because it's like, wow, I would totally love to get more girls of color involved in local communities. This sounds great. I want to get involved. I want to make sure this happens. She had a $1,500 goal, and so people came and participated. But she also kind of put a lot of thought into the invitation. And she had people back it at a $5 level, $25 level, and $50 and $75. But she also kind of shot for the moon and kind of created this $2,000 reward tier, right? And this was a beautiful invitation for someone who's got $2,000 to burn, right? And it was this kind of reward of being an executive producer. And it's amazing because who knew you could be an executive producer of a workbook? But like with Kickstarter, you can, right? And by doing so, you're creating kind of a socially normative way to invite someone who has that money to come in and spend that. And so we tell all of our students to create executive producer rewards for all of their projects, right? So create that space for people, and for the right person, this signal will resonate and they'll step in. And so not only did someone back this, but someone backed this within 1 hour of launching her project, which then fully funded her project. It was the fastest funded project in our class. But this is a great invitation. So it's just a good demonstration kind of those ideas. So in designing good signals, I think it's also good to think about fundamental principles that govern your work, especially if you're an existing creator who has a product or service or company. I think that when you're out there in the world, you have to think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And when I think about this notion of creating principles around your work, I think the best example that I can think of is actually from my friend Karen Chen, who's an award-winning independent film producer. And she has this philosophy as kind of her North Star for all of her projects. It's not just the stories that we choose to tell, but how we work with people, who we choose to work with, what communities we choose to build. And this really resonates because it's saying, hey, as a filmmaker, we're not just this industrialized complex for cranking out stories. How we choose to work with people, that affects not just the environment, but also just affects our own happiness. So, with this, Karen, chooses to tell complex stories around female protagonists. She wants to collaborate with her friends. She wants to work with upstanding organizations, and this is the thing that kind of aligns that. In venture capital, there's a similar concept of having an investment thesis, and so Union Square Ventures, the firm I worked at, had this as, and it's changed slightly over the years, but this notion of large networks of engaged users. And this is a signal to the market, to entrepreneurs, about what they are willing to invest in and what they are not, and who they want to partner with and what wouldn't make sense. And so putting signals out into the world is a really important thing, and that can only happen if you really know what your principles are. So for all of you in the audience who've been kind of sitting in an idea for a while, like maybe you haven't launched yet, here is some practical advice on getting started based on all of this really super abstract stuff that I've been talking about. So you're going to get bullet points, finally. It's really simple, and it's a 5-step process. Number one, just find some friends, right? And it could be like 5 people, it could be anybody. But this notion of creating things alone, I think, is a really horrible myth. So find people to work with. Choose to take on a crowdfunding challenge of about $1,000, right? And set an arbitrary date for when you're going to launch. And there's something about crowdfunding that naturally forces you to have to think about how you want to interface with the world and with the community. How do you want to create space for the executive producers in your life to come in, right? And this notion of creating a challenge makes it a story. It makes it exciting. It puts you at the center of the process rather than making you feel like you're just another cog. Meet weekly for help. Maybe it's a Saturday brunch, maybe it's a Saturday dinner. People love food, highly recommend food. And when you get together, don't think about the circle of people that you have as the beginning and the end of all of your advice and experience. All of those people are connected to other people, right? So become routers for each other in terms of gaining help and assistance. Work in public. Oh my gosh, this one is huge, right? There's a ton of value in the exhaust of your process, right? The exhaust of your process is your own narrative. Narratives power networks. They power inspiration in communities. And so, it's almost it's almost kind of a requirement. It should be it's socially responsibility, just as we think about how to be environmentally responsible, it's socially responsible to share your story of your process. Everyone has something to learn from your story. And then launch together, right? Promote each other's projects. Don't launch alone. Retweet things. And the key thing to keep in mind here, is to make this a multiplayer game, not a single-player game. And maybe this isn't exactly the flavor of multiplayer game that you want because you're more into first-person shooters versus RPGs or whatever they are, but construct some sort of multiplayer experience. And I think the biggest lesson is, we have this label that we kind of idolize of an independent creator. And I think you want to be independent in your thought, but I think what you want to do is to really foster interdependence in your process. So there you go. This would be your first network of creators that you can create for yourselves. Thank you.